At my wife's law school graduation dinner I paid for, she thought it'd be funny to introduce me like this. Meet my husband. No degree, no plan, just living off my income. Everyone laughed. I didn't. I smiled, raised my glass, and said, "Enjoy it. This is the last joke you'll ever make at my expense." Then I walked away, quietly reclaiming my peace. My name's Miles Carter, and I need you to understand something right off the bat. I'm not the kind of guy who loses his cool in public. I don't throw drinks in people's faces, I don't flip tables like I'm auditioning for a reality show, and I sure as hell don't make scenes that end up on someone's Instagram story with crying laughing emojis. But on the night my wife decided to roast me like a Thanksgiving turkey in front of her entire law school graduating class, their pompous professors, and her parents who'd never liked me anyway, I discovered something profound about the human condition. Specifically, my condition. Turns out, champagne burns like battery acid when you're swallowing it alongside a heaping serving of public betrayal, and dignity, real, bone-deep dignity, pairs surprisingly well with stone-cold silence. Let me paint you a picture of how spectacularly this evening went down. I'd spent 3 weeks planning this graduation dinner because Amelia, my wife of 5 years, had finally finished law school. And listen, I was genuinely proud of her. She'd worked her ass off, pulled all-nighters that would make a truck driver weep, and memorized more Latin phrases than a Catholic priest on speed. So yeah, I wanted to celebrate her. I booked the Green Marlin, this ridiculously overpriced seafood place downtown, where the bread rolls come with their own origin stories, and the waiters look at you like they're doing you a personal favor by bringing you water. I'm talking about the kind of restaurant where you need to take out a small loan just to afford the valet parking, but whatever. This was Amelia's night, and I was determined to make it perfect. I handled everything, and I mean everything. Sent out the invitations, coordinated with her neurotic mother about the seating arrangements, confirmed the private dining room 3 separate times, because apparently that's what you do when you're married to someone whose family treats every event like it's a state dinner. I even, and this is where I should have known I was in too deep, ironed her parents' matching navy blazers because they wanted to look important for the photos. Her dad, Harold, had shown up at our apartment the day before with these wrinkled jackets that looked like they'd been stored in a gym bag since 1987, and he'd looked at me with those watery blue eyes and said, "Son, you think you could work your magic on these?" And like the absolute chump I was, I said sure, spent 45 minutes steaming out creases while watching YouTube videos on proper lapel technique, because God forbid the in-laws show up looking anything less than camera-ready to celebrate a daughter who barely acknowledged my existence. The dinner started off fine, if you consider fine to mean awkwardly navigating conversations with people who'd never bothered to learn what I actually did for a living. Amelia's law school friends were there, this collection of sharp-dressed sharks in designer suits who all had the same aggressive handshake and the same practiced laugh that sounded like money. They'd clink their glasses, toast to justice and democracy, and other abstract concepts they'd probably stop caring about the second they landed their first corporate gig, and I'd smile and nod like a dashboard bobblehead. Her professors showed up too, these intellectual types who'd spent the appetizer course explaining legal theories to each other in increasingly pretentious voices, as if the rest of us couldn't possibly understand the complex nuances of constitutional law. Spoiler alert, we didn't care. I sat there in my off-the-rack suit, the one I'd bought on sale at Macy's because I'm not made of money, despite what some people apparently thought, and I watched my wife absolutely glow. She was wearing this emerald green dress that probably cost more than my truck payment, her dark hair pulled back in one of those effortless updos that actually takes an hour to create, and she was holding court like a queen addressing her subjects. People kept congratulating her, telling her how brilliant she was, how far she'd go, how she was destined for greatness. And I sat there thinking, yeah, she is pretty amazing. Look at what she accomplished. Look at what we accomplished together. That's when she stood up. The room got quiet, that expectant kind of silence you get right before someone makes a speech. Amelia picked up her champagne glass, and she smiled. This absolutely radiant, angelic smile that I'd fallen in love with 5 years ago when she'd walked into my office asking if I could recover her corrupted thesis files. Everyone leaned in. I thought maybe she was going to thank me, acknowledge the sacrifices we'd both made, talk about how we were a team. How beautifully naive of me. "I want to take a moment," she said. her voice carrying that confident courtroom projection they'd taught her. To acknowledge my husband, Miles. She gestured toward me with her glass, and I felt this weird flutter of hope mixed with dread. Everyone, this is the man who's been by my side through all of this. The man who supported me emotionally through every late night, every breakdown, every crisis. She paused for effect, and I swear to God, I saw the punchline coming a full second before she delivered it. Emotionally, but not intellectually. Because let's be honest, and here she laughed, this light, tinkling laugh that made everyone else laugh too. No degree, no plan, just living off my income and fixing things around the house. But hey, every successful woman needs a good handyman, right? The table absolutely erupted. I'm talking volcanic levels of laughter. Her best friend from law school, this woman named Stephanie who'd never said more than 3 words to me in 5 years, literally spit her wine back into her glass. One of the professors, this distinguished-looking guy with a silver beard, actually started clapping like he'd just witnessed the world's greatest comedy routine. Harold was chuckling and shaking his head like I was some kind of lovable sitcom character, and Diane, my mother-in-law, had this satisfied smirk on her face like she'd been waiting years for someone to finally say what they'd all been thinking. Even the waiter, this 20-something kid who'd been hovering nearby, cracked a smile before catching himself. I sat there with my champagne glass in my hand, my face arranged in what I hoped looked like a good-natured smile, and I felt something inside me shift. Not break, exactly. More like realign. Suddenly, with perfect clarity, I understood that I'd been financing my own humiliation for 5 solid years. Every tuition payment, every sacrificed weekend, every time I'd worked double shifts so she could focus on studying, it had all been building toward this moment, where I got to be the punchline at my own expense. When the laughter finally died down to scattered chuckles, I stood up. Every eye in that room turned to me, probably expecting me to laugh it off, play along, be the good sport. Instead, I raised my glass, looked my wife dead in the eye, and said in a voice that was perfectly calm, perfectly level, "Enjoy it, Amelia. That's the last joke you'll ever make at my expense." Then I set down my glass, adjusted my jacket, and walked out of that private dining room with my head held high. No yelling, no dramatic speeches, no throwing things or making threats. Just one quiet man who'd finally realized that loyalty without respect is just a fancy word for doormat. I walked past the shocked faces, past the suddenly silent table, past the concerned-looking hostess, and straight out into the parking lot where the night air hit me like a revelation. I stood there next to my truck, pulled out my phone, and typed 4 rules into my notes app, my fingers shaking slightly from adrenaline or rage, or maybe just the pure relief of finally standing up for myself. Don't text her back. Document everything. Protect my peace and my paycheck. Never again confuse loyalty with stupidity. I read them over twice, committed them to memory, and felt the night breeze on my face. It smelled like freedom mixed with fury, like possibilities and endings all rolled into one. And for the first time in 5 years, I felt like the protagonist of my own damn story. Let me take you back to the beginning, because every disaster movie needs an origin story, and mine starts in the least romantic place imaginable. The campus IT help desk where I was moonlighting to pick up extra cash. It was a Tuesday afternoon in September, one of those early fall days where the air conditioning is fighting a losing battle against the lingering summer heat, and I was 3 hours into a shift that consisted mainly of explaining to freshmen that turning their computer off and on again actually does solve most problems. That's when Amelia Richardson walked into my life carrying a laptop that was apparently holding her entire academic future hostage. She burst through the door like a tornado in designer jeans, her dark hair falling out of a messy bun, mascara slightly smudged under her eyes in that way that suggested she'd either been crying or rubbing her face in frustration for the past hour. Probably both. "Please tell me you can help me," she said, and I swear to God, it wasn't her looks that got me. Though yeah, she was gorgeous in that effortless way some women just are. It was the genuine panic in her voice. "My thesis file corrupted, and I have a presentation in 3 hours, and if I don't recover this document, I'm going to have a complete mental breakdown right here in your office and probably get expelled for disturbing the peace." I should mention that I wasn't even supposed to be working IT. My actual job, my real career, was running a small construction management company that I'd started right out of high school when everyone else was applying to colleges and drowning in student loan applications. While my former classmates were debating philosophy and getting drunk at frat parties, I was learning how to read blueprints, manage subcontractors, and turn a profit on residential renovation projects. It was blue-collar work, sure, but it was honest work that paid actual money and taught me skills that didn't come from a textbook. The IT gig was just something I did on the side because the university paid well and the work was mindless enough that I could do it half asleep. But back to Amelia and her corrupted thesis. I took her laptop, ran some recovery software, and managed to retrieve about 90% of her document while she paced around my tiny office like a caged animal, alternating between thanking me profusely and catastrophizing about her academic career. "You're literally saving my life right now," she kept saying, which I found both charming and slightly concerning from a mental health perspective. When I finally handed the laptop back with her thesis intact, she looked at me like I'd just pulled her puppy out of a burning building. "I owe you," she said. "Coffee? Dinner?" "My firstborn child." I laughed and told her coffee was fine, mostly because I figured that would be the end of it. Girl gets her thesis back, buys the IT guy a thank you latte, everyone goes on with their lives. Except Amelia didn't let it end there. She showed up the next week with an actual homemade coffee cake, which she claimed was a family recipe, but later admitted she'd found on Pinterest and stress-baked at 2 in the morning. The week after that, she started just dropping by to chat between classes, asking me about my construction projects with what seemed like genuine interest. "I love that you actually build things," she'd say, running her fingers along the calluses on my palms. "Everyone here just talks and theorizes. You make real things that people can touch and use. That's so refreshing." Looking back now, I can see all the red flags I missed. But at the time, man, I was 24 years old, running my own business, and this brilliant, beautiful law student was choosing to spend her free time in my cramped office that smelled like old coffee and printer ink. She'd tell me about her cases and her classes, about her dreams of becoming a civil rights attorney and changing the world one lawsuit at a time, and I'd listen like she was describing the plot of the greatest movie ever made. She made me feel like I was part of something bigger than myself, like my support mattered, like we were building something together even if I was the one doing it with actual tools and materials. We dated for 8 months before I proposed, which everyone said was too fast, but I'd never been the kind of guy who waffled on big decisions. When you know, or at least that's what I told myself. I proposed at a construction site, actually, this gorgeous Victorian house I was restoring in the historic district. I'd brought her there at sunset, showed her the work we'd done on the ornate crown molding and the original hardwood floors, and I told her that I wanted to build a life with her the same way I built houses, with careful planning, solid foundations, and the kind of commitment that lasts generations. She cried and said yes, and I remember thinking I was the luckiest guy in the world. When we got married, she was starting her second year of law school, and I was riding high on a series of successful commercial projects that had my company's bank account looking healthier than it ever had. We had this unspoken understanding that I'd be the financial anchor while she focused on school. She had dreams of changing the world through legal reform and advocacy, and I had dreams of building it. Literally constructing the homes and buildings where people would live those changed lives. For a while, it genuinely felt like a partnership. We'd stay up late talking about our future. She'd open her own practice fighting for the underdog, and I'd expand my company to include sustainable construction techniques. We'd be this power couple, each successful in our own right, proving that you didn't need 2 lawyers or 2 doctors to make it work. But somewhere along the way, and I can't pinpoint exactly when it happened, the narrative shifted. Slowly, subtly, like water eroding stone, I went from being Miles Carter, successful business owner and equal partner, to just Amelia's husband. It started with little things. At law school events, people would introduce themselves to her with enthusiasm and barely glance my way. "And you are?" they'd ask, as if my presence required explanation. "That's my husband, Miles," Amelia would say, and they'd nod politely before immediately redirecting the conversation back to her. Nobody ever asked what I did for work. Nobody cared that I was running projects that employed 15 people and generated 6 figures annually. I wasn't wearing a suit and quoting Supreme Court cases, so I might as well have been invisible. Her friends were the worst. This crew of ambitious law students who all seemed to shop at the same expensive stores and share the same worldview that equated education level with human value. They'd come over to our apartment, the apartment I was paying for, mind you, and they'd sprawl across our furniture drinking the wine I'd bought, complaining about their case loads and their professors while completely ignoring my existence unless they needed something. Miles, can you grab more ice? Miles, do you have a phone charger? Miles, would you mind turning down the game? We're trying to discuss important things. I became the guy who fetched things and stayed quiet, the human equivalent of background furniture with a wallet attached. The real kicker was how Amelia started introducing me at events. In the beginning, she'd brag about my business, tell people about the historic homes I was restoring, make me sound like some kind of artisan craftsman. But as law school progressed and her friend group became more established, those introductions got vaguer. "This is Miles, my husband," she'd say, with no follow-up, no context, as if that was all anyone needed to know about me. When people did ask what I did, she'd answer before I could. "He runs a small construction company," with the emphasis on small that made it sound like I was hammering together birdhouses in our garage rather than managing million-dollar renovation projects. I worked my ass off during those years. I'm talking 12-hour days on job sites, coming home covered in sawdust and drywall dust, grabbing a quick shower before making dinner because Amelia had a study group or a late class. I paid her tuition bills without complaint, watched our joint savings account drain to cover her books and bar exam prep courses, survived on gas station coffee and vending machine snacks because I was too busy to eat proper meals. Meanwhile, she collected degrees and accolades and applause. She made law review. She won a mock trial competition. She got an internship at a prestigious firm that paid basically nothing but looked great on a resume. And every achievement was celebrated by everyone, her parents, her friends, her professors. While my contributions went unmentioned and unnoticed, her mother, Diane, made it especially clear what she thought of our arrangement. She'd visit our apartment, scan the space with those judgmental eyes, and make little comments. "Still doing the construction thing, Miles?" she'd ask, like it was a hobby I'd eventually grow out of. "I'm sure once Amelia's established in her career, you'll have more opportunities to explore other options." Translation: once my daughter doesn't need your money anymore, maybe you can go back to school and become someone worth acknowledging at dinner parties. Harold, her dad, wasn't much better. He'd clap me on the shoulder and call me son, in this patronizing way that made it clear he saw me as a temporary fixture in his daughter's life, a supporting character who'd be written out eventually. But through it all, I genuinely believed we were partners. I thought I was investing in our future, building something solid that would pay off when things got easier. I told myself that relationships require sacrifice, that marriages mean supporting each other's dreams even when it's hard, that love isn't always equal in every moment but balances out over time. I convinced myself that Amelia appreciated what I was doing, that she saw my value even if nobody else did, that eventually the world would recognize that partnership comes in different forms and that blue-collar success is still success. What I didn't realize, what I was too stubborn or too loyal or too damn stupid to see, was that the world had already convinced her otherwise. Somewhere between her first semester and her graduation, between the praise from professors and the validation from her peers, Amelia had started believing that love with a degree outranks love without one. That intellect measured by diplomas matters more than dedication measured by actions. That supporting her emotionally was nice, but not supporting her intellectually made me fundamentally less than. And by the time I figured it out, I'd already spent 5 years playing a supporting role in my own life, funding a show where I wasn't even credited in the program. The Green Marlin was the kind of restaurant where you could practically hear your bank account sobbing the moment you walked through the door. I'm talking marble floors so polished you could see your soul reflecting back at you, chandeliers that probably cost more than my truck, and waitstaff who moved with the kind of silent efficiency that made you feel like you were dining in a 5-star hotel rather than a seafood joint that happened to serve oysters at $20 a pop. The hostess who greeted me when I arrived to check on the private dining room looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine, all sleek black dress and perfectly contoured cheekbones, and she smiled at me with the kind of professional warmth that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Carter, your party room is ready. We've arranged everything exactly as you specified." I'd spent $2,000 on this dinner. $2,000 that could have gone toward new equipment for my crew, or a weekend getaway, or literally anything other than feeding a room full of people who were about to watch my wife publicly eviscerate me. But hindsight's 2020, and past Miles was still operating under the delusion that grand romantic gestures mattered in a marriage where only one person was keeping score. I'd ordered the premium package, the filet mignon and lobster tail combo, the fancy wine pairings that came with descriptions longer than most people's wedding vows, and a chocolate lava cake dessert that the menu promised would transport your palate to culinary heaven. The private room itself was gorgeous, all dark wood paneling and soft lighting, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor where sailboats bobbed like fancy toys for rich people. Amelia's parents arrived first, naturally, because Diane Richardson treated punctuality like it was a competitive sport she was determined to win. They swept into the restaurant 15 minutes early, Harold in his freshly ironed navy blazer looking like a retired yacht club commodore, and Diane dripping in pearls that could have funded a small nation's GDP. Miles, Diane air-kissed near my cheeks without actually making contact, because God forbid she smudge her lipstick. What a lovely venue. Though I must say, we were surprised you didn't choose the Harborview. That's where we celebrated Harold's retirement, and the service was absolutely impeccable. Translation: this place is nice, but we know somewhere better, and we're going to make sure you know that we know. Harold shook my hand with the grip of a man who'd spent his career in corporate law crushing smaller fish, and he surveyed the room with the critical eye of someone mentally calculating whether I'd spent enough money to properly honor his daughter's achievement. "Good job with the setup, son," he said, which was probably the closest thing to a compliment I'd ever gotten from him. "Amelia's going to be thrilled. She deserves a night like this after all her hard work." Notice how there was no mention of my hard work, or the fact that I'd been the one bankrolling her education while she chased her dreams, but whatever. I was used to being the invisible ATM in the corner of the room. The law school crowd started trickling in around 6:30, and let me tell you, watching them arrive was like witnessing a parade of people who'd all received the same memo about how to dress like you're about to foreclose on someone's house. The men wore suits that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, and the women had this uniform look of expensive haircuts, statement jewelry, and heels that could double as murder weapons. They greeted each other with enthusiastic hugs and inside jokes about professors and cases, forming these little clusters of conversation that might as well have had "No blue-collar workers allowed" signs hanging over them. There was Stephanie Chun, Amelia's best friend and study partner, who'd never liked me from day one. She was this razor-sharp woman from New York who talked fast, thought faster, and had opinions about everything from international trade law to the proper way to fold a napkin. She breezed past me with a tight smile and a "Hey, Miles," before immediately finding Amelia and launching into some animated story that had them both laughing. Then came Marcus Webb, this guy who'd competed with Amelia for top grades their entire first year before they'd apparently called a truce and become friends. He was tall, black, impeccably dressed, and had the kind of confident handshake that made you feel like you were being evaluated and found wanting all in the span of 2 seconds. "You must be proud, man," he said to me, and I nodded because what else was I supposed to say? That I was proud, but also exhausted and starting to resent being treated like the help at my own wife's celebration. The professors showed up fashionably late, as professors do, floating in with that particular brand of academic arrogance that comes from spending decades telling 20-year-olds that they're brilliant. There was Professor Whitmore, this distinguished-looking guy with a silver beard who taught constitutional law and apparently thought he was the second coming of Thurgood Marshall based on how everyone fawned over him. He held court near the bar, already 3 drinks deep and pontificating about some recent Supreme Court decision to a circle of admirers who hung on his every word. And Professor Chun, no relation to Stephanie, this tiny woman with steel gray hair who taught contracts and had a reputation for being tougher than a $2 steak. She scared the hell out of most students, but Amelia had somehow won her over, and now she was standing near the windows, wine glass in hand, nodding approvingly at the venue like I'd passed some kind of test I didn't know I was taking. I floated through the cocktail hour making small talk and playing the gracious host, refilling drinks and making sure everyone knew where the bathrooms were, basically acting like a really well-dressed butler at an event I was paying for. Nobody asked me about my work. Nobody inquired about my life. A few people mentioned that the venue was nice, and one guy, I think his name was Josh or Jake or something equally forgettable, actually said, "Must be nice having a wife who's going to be making bank soon, huh?" And he winked like we were sharing some kind of bro moment about gold digging. Except the joke was on him, because I was the one who'd been funding this entire operation from day one. When we finally sat down for dinner, I found myself positioned at the head of the table next to Amelia, who looked absolutely radiant in her emerald dress. She kept squeezing my hand under the table, leaning over to whisper things like, "Thank you for doing this, and this is perfect," and I genuinely believed she meant it. The first course came out, some kind of fancy salad with edible flowers that tasted like grass, but looked Instagram-worthy, and everyone oohed and awed appropriately. The conversation flowed around me like water around a rock, all talk of internships and job offers and bar exam strategies, and I sat there smiling and nodding like one of those dashboard bobbleheads, contributing nothing because I had nothing to contribute to their world. The main course arrived, and I have to admit, that filet mignon was cooked to absolute perfection. Tender, juicy, practically melting on the fork. For about 15 minutes, I actually relaxed and thought maybe this evening would be okay. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe Amelia did appreciate everything I'd done, and this was her night to shine, and I could handle being in the background because that's what partners do. We take turns. We support each other. We don't keep score. Then Professor Whitmore stood up and tapped his wine glass with a fork, calling for everyone's attention. "I'd like to propose a toast," he announced in that booming professor voice that probably carried to the cheap seats without a microphone. "To our graduates, who've worked tirelessly for 3 years to master one of the most challenging disciplines in academia. You've earned your place in this profession, and we couldn't be prouder." Everyone raised their glasses, clinked them together, took sips while murmuring agreement. Standard graduation toast stuff. Nothing offensive, nothing weird. But then Amelia stood up, and I should have known. I should have felt it coming the way animals supposedly sense earthquakes before they hit. She picked up her champagne flute, and that beautiful smile spread across her face, and the room went quiet with anticipation because everyone loved Amelia. Everyone wanted to hear what brilliant, accomplished, future attorney Amelia Richardson had to say. "Thank you all so much for being here," she started, her voice carrying that perfect blend of gratitude and confidence they must teach in some secret law school class. "This journey has been incredible, and I couldn't have done it without an amazing support system." She gestured around the table, acknowledging her parents, her friends, her professors. Then her eyes landed on me, and she smiled wider. "But I especially want to acknowledge my husband, Miles." Here it comes, I thought. Here's where she thanks me for the tuition payments and the late-night coffee runs, and the 5 years of putting her dreams ahead of my own. "Everyone, this is the man who's been by my side through all of this," she continued, and people turned to look at me with polite smiles. "The man who supported me emotionally through every late night, every breakdown, every existential crisis about whether I'd chosen the right career path." She paused, and I saw something flicker in her expression. Something that should have been a warning, but came too fast for me to process. He supported me emotionally, but not intellectually, because let's be honest, and here she laughed, this crystalline laugh that invited everyone else to join in. No degree, no plan, just living off my income and fixing things around the house. But hey, every successful woman needs a good handyman, right? The laughter hit me like a physical force. It erupted from every corner of that table, loud and sharp and utterly delighted. Stephanie literally spit her wine back into her glass, her eyes going wide with shocked amusement. Marcus was chuckling and shaking his head. Professor Whitmore, that distinguished bastard, started actually clapping, like this was the punchline to end all punchlines. Harold was grinning and nodding like his daughter had just delivered a closing argument that would go down in legal history. Diane had this satisfied little smirk on her face, the kind that said she'd been thinking this exact thing for 5 years and was thrilled someone finally had the guts to say it out loud. Even the waiter, this kid who couldn't have been more than 22 and was standing by the door with a water pitcher, cracked a smile before catching himself and rearranging his face into professional neutrality. The whole room was laughing at me, at my expense, at the joke of my existence in Amelia's orbit. And my wife, the woman I'd loved and supported and sacrificed for, stood there beaming like she'd just won her first case. I sat there with my champagne glass halfway to my lips, my face frozen in what I desperately hoped looked like a good-natured smile rather than the mask of absolute devastation it felt like. My brain was doing this weird thing where it simultaneously understood exactly what had just happened, while also refusing to fully process it, like trying to compute an equation that doesn't quite make mathematical sense. This was the woman I'd married. This was the person I'd built my life around. And she'd just reduced me to a punchline, a supporting character, a handyman who existed to serve her narrative. When the laughter finally started to die down, I made my decision. I drove to Leo's apartment in complete silence, which is weird for me because I'm usually the guy who needs music or podcasts or some kind of audio distraction to keep my brain from spiraling into dark places. But that night, I couldn't handle noise. I needed the quiet to process what had just happened, to let the full weight of my humiliation settle into my bones like radioactive material that would probably give me emotional cancer in about 10 years. The streets of downtown were relatively empty for a Saturday night, just the occasional cluster of college kids stumbling between bars and a few homeless guys camped out near the transit station. My truck's engine rumbled at stoplights, and I watched the red glow reflecting off my hood, thinking about how appropriate it was that everything looked angry and inflamed, because that's exactly how I felt inside. Leo Martinez had been my best friend since high school, back when we were both young and stupid and thought we could conquer the world with nothing but ambition and terrible haircuts. While I'd gone into construction, Leo had followed his passion for cooking and now ran a food truck called Taco Fury that served Korean-Mexican fusion and had a cult following among the downtown lunch crowd. He was the kind of guy who thought emotional support meant ordering extra food and not asking too many questions, which honestly made him the perfect person to crash with when your life was imploding. He lived in this converted warehouse loft in the Arts District, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and pipes running across the ceiling that somehow looked cool instead of unfinished. His rent was probably highway robbery, but the space had character and a full kitchen, which for Leo was all that mattered. I texted him from the parking lot. "You home? Need a place to crash." Long story. 3 dots appeared immediately, then, doors open. "I've got beer and leftover bulgogi. Come on up." This is why Leo was my best friend. No dramatic questions, no demand for immediate explanations, just an open door and the promise of food. I grabbed my phone and wallet from the truck. I'd left everything else at the apartment I shared with Amelia, because I'd stormed out like a man on a mission rather than someone planning an extended stay, and headed up the industrial metal stairs that led to his second-floor loft. Leo opened the door before I could knock, took one look at my face, and said, "Oh shit, this is bad, isn't it?" He was wearing his standard off-duty uniform of cargo shorts and a faded band t-shirt from some concert we'd gone to in 2019, his dark hair sticking up in about 7 different directions because he'd probably been napping on the couch. Leo was short, stocky, and had the kind of permanent 5 o'clock shadow that made him look vaguely threatening until he smiled, and you realized he was basically a human teddy bear who happened to be really good with a knife. "It's so bad," I said, walking past him into the loft. Like, epically bad. Titanic hitting the iceberg levels of bad. I collapsed onto his beat-up leather couch that he'd found at a estate sale and claimed had character, which was code for multiple mystery stains and a weird smell. Honestly, after the pristine elegance of the Green Marlin, that ratty couch felt like coming home. Leo disappeared into his kitchen and returned approximately 90 seconds later with 2 beers and a pizza box that he dropped on the coffee table with the reverence of a man presenting a sacred offering. "Talk," he commanded, settling into his armchair and propping his feet up on a milk crate he used as an ottoman. "What happened? Did someone die? Did your truck finally give up the ghost? Did Amelia actually turn out to be a Russian spy like I always suspected?" I laughed despite everything, popped open the beer, and took a long pull before diving into the whole sordid story. I told him about planning the dinner, about ironing her parents' matching blazers like some kind of domestic servant, about the fancy restaurant and the expensive wine, and how I'd thought I was doing something nice for my wife. Then I got to the toast, and I watched Leo's expression shift from curious to shocked to absolutely furious in the span of about 30 seconds. "She said what?" Leo interrupted when I got to the punchline. "No degree, no plan, living off her income?" Dude, you've been paying her tuition for 5 years. You've been keeping her afloat this whole time. Living off her income? She doesn't even have an income yet. She's been living off your income. I know, I said, and hearing someone else articulate what I'd been thinking made it feel more real, more valid, like I wasn't just being oversensitive or misunderstanding the situation. And everyone laughed, man. Her parents, her friends, her professors, they all thought it was hilarious. Like I was the court jester whose entire purpose was to be the butt of the joke. Leo opened the pizza box, pepperoni and jalapeno, my favorite, and shoved a slice at me with the kind of aggressive care that said he was too angry to express actual sympathy. Damn, he said, shaking his head slowly. You married a TED Talk in heels. That made me laugh for real, the first genuine laugh I'd had since walking out of that restaurant. A TED Talk in heels. Oh my God, that's exactly what she is. Today I'm going to talk about how I'm amazing and everyone who isn't me is basically decorative furniture. And she probably has a PowerPoint, Leo added, warming to the theme, with graphs showing her superiority and pie charts breaking down why her husband is basically a glorified appliance. He took a massive bite of pizza, chewed thoughtfully, then pointed the crust at me. So what did you say? Please tell me you said something. Please tell me you didn't just sit there and take it. I told her to enjoy it because that was the last joke she'd ever make at my expense, I said, and even now, hours later, I felt a surge of satisfaction remembering the look on her face. Then I walked out, just stood up, adjusted my jacket, and left. Didn't yell, didn't make a scene, just left. Leo whistled low and long. Stone cold. I'm proud of you, man. Most guys would have either exploded or just sat there and taken it. You did the dignified middle finger. That's impressive. He grabbed another slice of pizza and settled back in his chair. So what now? You going back tonight? Tomorrow? Are we in divorce territory or just really bad fight territory? I don't know yet, I admitted, pulling out my phone. But I'm going to do what I should have done a long time ago. I'm going to document everything. I opened a new note and started typing while Leo watched with interest. Every tuition payment, every loan I co-signed, every time I worked double shifts so she could study, every dinner I cooked, every errand I ran, every sacrifice I made that she apparently thinks counts for nothing. The list started coming together quickly, probably because I'd been mentally keeping track of it for years without realizing it. Fall 2020, $8,500 for first semester tuition. Spring 2021, $8,500 for second semester, plus $2,200 for books and course materials. Summer 2021, covered all living expenses, $3 for $100 in rent, utilities, groceries, while she did an unpaid internship. The numbers kept adding up, a running tab of financial sacrifice that I'd never expected to collect on, but that suddenly felt really important to acknowledge existed. Holy shit, Leo said, leaning forward to look at my screen. That's a lot of money, dude. Like, new truck money, down payment on a house money, early retirement money. He grabbed his own phone and started tapping. Okay, I'm not just going to sit here and let you spiral. I'm ordering more food because this situation requires carbs. What do you want from Chang's? And don't say nothing because I will literally fight you. Crab Rangoon, I said absently, still typing. And maybe those scallion pancakes. I scrolled through my phone's photo gallery, finding pictures of receipts I'd saved for tax purposes that showed just how much I'd spent on Amelia's education and living expenses. There was the receipt from the bookstore where I dropped $800 on her textbooks for constitutional law and criminal procedure. The confirmation email from when I'd paid for her bar exam prep course, $3, $200 that I'd put on a credit card and spent 6 months paying off. The deposit slip showing I'd co-signed her student loan for $25,000 because her parents refused to help and she couldn't qualify on her own. Every piece of evidence was another brick in the wall of documentation I was building, proof that I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't been imagining my contributions to our partnership. I found emails where she'd asked me to cover expenses because she was too busy studying to pick up shifts at the part-time paralegal job she'd worked for exactly 1 semester before quitting. Text messages where she'd thank me for being supportive and understanding, promising that things would get easier once she graduated and started working. Screenshots of our joint bank account showing deposits from my business and withdrawals for her expenses, a one-way flow of money that apparently entitled her to publicly mock me as a freeloader. You know what's crazy? I said, looking up from my phone. I never thought of it as keeping score. I genuinely believed we were building something together. Like, she's investing in her future, I'm supporting that investment, and eventually we both benefit from her success. That's how marriages are supposed to work, right? You support each other's dreams. Sure, Leo said, but support is supposed to be mutual, and it's definitely not supposed to come with public humiliation as a bonus feature. His phone buzzed with the food delivery notification. Okay, Chang's will be here in 20 minutes. In the meantime, you're going to finish that list, we're going to figure out your game plan, and you're going to sleep on my couch for as long as you need to. Mi casa es su casa, hermano. I spent the next hour compiling what essentially amounted to a financial autopsy of my marriage. 5 years of tuition payments, living expenses, supporting her through unpaid internships and exam prep, covering the cost of her professional wardrobe because apparently looking like a lawyer costs about the same as actually being one. The grand total came to just over $127,000, which was roughly what I'd spent on her education and living expenses while she pursued her dreams. $127,000 that I'd invested in a partnership that she apparently saw as a charity case. When the Chinese food arrived, Leo spread it out on the coffee table like a buffet, and we ate in comfortable silence for a while. The crab rangoon was perfect, crispy on the outside, creamy on the inside, exactly the kind of comfort food my soul needed. The scallion pancakes were hot and flaky and slightly greasy in the best possible way. We demolished most of the food, and I felt some of the tension starting to ease from my shoulders. So here's what I'm thinking, Leo said, wiping his hands on a napkin. Tomorrow, you go back to the apartment when you know she's not there. You pack a bag with your essentials, clothes, toiletries, important documents. You move that stuff here temporarily. Then you call a lawyer, a good one, and you start figuring out your options. Because here's the thing, man, you don't have to decide about divorce tonight or tomorrow or even next week. But you do need to protect yourself. He was right, of course. I needed to think strategically, not emotionally. I needed to be smart about this, document everything, and make decisions based on facts rather than feelings. I woke up on Leo's couch the next morning with a crick in my neck that felt like someone had replaced my vertebrae with rusty bolts, a headache that was probably half dehydration and half existential crisis, and the kind of clarity that only comes when you've spent the night mentally replaying your public humiliation on a loop until your brain finally says, okay, enough wallowing, time to do something about this. The morning light was streaming through Leo's industrial windows at an angle specifically designed to assault hungover eyeballs, and I could hear him clanging around in the kitchen, probably stress cooking his feelings into something that would either be delicious or require a fire extinguisher. The smell of coffee and bacon was enough to lure me off the couch, and I shuffled into the kitchen looking like a before picture in one of those life transformation ads. You look like hell, Leo said cheerfully, sliding a plate of breakfast tacos across the counter. But you smell like revenge, which is an improvement. What's the plan? He was already dressed for work in his Taco Fury t-shirt and backwards cap, looking annoyingly alert for someone who'd stayed up until 2 in the morning helping me compile evidence of my failed marriage. Lawyer, I said, my voice still rough from sleep. I need to talk to a lawyer. Know any good ones? The irony wasn't lost on me that I was asking for legal advice after spending 5 years married to someone who was supposedly qualified to provide it. But here we were, living in a reality where the person who should have had my back was the one who'd stabbed me in it. Leo pulled out his phone and started scrolling. Actually, yeah, remember my cousin Maria? The one who got divorced last year from that tech bro, who tried to claim her food truck business was community property, even though she started it before they met. I nodded vaguely, remembering some family drama Leo had mentioned involving restraining orders and disputed assets. She used this lawyer named Grace Holloway who apparently ate the guy alive in court. Like, legally speaking, there wasn't enough left of him to fill a shot glass. Maria said she was expensive but worth every penny. Give me the number, I said, and Leo forwarded me the contact information along with a text that just said, go get M, Tiger, followed by about 7 different punching fist emojis. I called the number right there in Leo's kitchen, half expecting to get a receptionist who'd tell me the earliest appointment was sometime in the next fiscal quarter, but instead I got a woman with a voice like bourbon and cigarettes who identified herself as Grace Holloway and asked what I needed in a tone that suggested she didn't have time for nonsense, but would make time for interesting cases. My wife publicly humiliated me at her graduation dinner after I spent 5 years financing her law degree. I said, figuring there was no point in sugarcoating it. I need to know what my options are, legally speaking, and whether I'm entitled to any kind of compensation for basically funding her entire career while she treated me like hired help. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a low chuckle that sounded equal parts amused and predatory. Oh, I like you already. Come to my office at 11. Bring documentation if you have it, but don't worry if you don't. We'll figure out what we need. My rate is $350 an hour for consultation, and if you decide to retain me, we'll discuss a payment plan. Sound good? $350 an hour was roughly what I charged for a full day of construction consultation, but I had a feeling this was going to be worth it. I'll be there, I said, and she rattled off an address in the financial district before hanging up without any of the polite goodbyes normal people exchange. I liked her already. Grace Holloway's office was located on the 14th floor of a glass tower that looked like it had been designed by someone who really believed in the power of intimidation through architecture. The lobby had that sterile corporate aesthetic, all marble and chrome and uncomfortable modernist furniture that was probably worth more than my truck, but looked like it had been designed specifically to prevent people from relaxing. The elevator played smooth jazz that made me want to commit minor property crimes, and when I reached the 14th floor, I was greeted by a reception area that managed to be both minimalist and expensive, like someone had spent a fortune making sure you knew they didn't need to try too hard. The receptionist was a young guy in his 20s with perfect hair and a name tag that said Dylan, and he looked me over with the kind of assessing glance that suggested he was very good at determining whether people could afford to be there. "Mr. Carter?" he asked, and when I nodded, he gestured toward a hallway. "Miss Holloway is ready for you. Second door on the left. Can I get you water, coffee, or anything else?" "I'm good," I said, following his directions down a hallway lined with what I assumed were expensive abstract paintings, but might have just been color samples from a hardware store for all I could tell. I knocked on the second door, heard a brisk "come in," and entered what could only be described as the office of someone who'd won a lot of arguments and wanted you to know it. Grace Holloway was sitting behind a massive desk made of dark wood that probably came from a tree that had been personally offended by being cut down, and she stood when I entered with the kind of fluid movement that suggested she spent her free time doing something athletic and possibly violent. She was maybe 40, with dark hair cut in a sharp bob, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, and she had the kind of direct eye contact that made you feel like she could see through your skull and read your thoughts like a boring book she'd already read twice before. She was beautiful in that intimidating way that made you understand why ancient civilizations worshipped warrior goddesses. "Miles Carter," she said, extending a hand with a grip that could have crushed walnuts. "Grace Holloway, have a seat and tell me everything, starting from the beginning, and don't leave out any details no matter how embarrassing or stupid you think they make you look. I've heard worse, I promise." I sat in the leather chair across from her desk and launched into the whole sordid tale. How Amelia and I met, how I'd supported her through law school, the financial sacrifices I'd made, and finally, the graduation dinner disaster that had ended with me walking out and spending the night on my best friend's couch. Grace listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad with handwriting that looked like it could cut glass, and her expression remained professionally neutral until I got to the part about Amelia's toast. "Wait," she said, holding up one perfectly manicured hand. "Let me make sure I'm understanding this correctly. You financed her entire legal education to the tune of, how much did you say?" I told her the number I'd calculated the night before, and her eyebrows went up slightly. "You financed her legal education to the tune of $127,000, supported her through 3 years of school and various unpaid internships, and then she publicly rebranded you as her charity case? In front of her colleagues, professors, and family. That's about the size of it," I said, and even saying it out loud to a stranger made me feel that mixture of rage and humiliation all over again. And everyone laughed, like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. This idea that I was some kind of kept man living off her income when she literally didn't have an income and had been living off mine for 5 years. Grace leaned back in her chair, and a slow smile spread across her face that would have made a shark nervous. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter," she said, and there was genuine amusement in her voice. "You've just graduated from Naive Husband University with honors. Welcome to the real world, where love doesn't conquer all, and sometimes the person you marry turns out to be a narcissistic asshole with a law degree. The good news is, you're done with the education phase. Now let's get you your refund." I couldn't help but laugh at that, because the absurdity of the situation was starting to hit me. I'd spent 5 years supporting someone who'd apparently seen me as nothing more than a convenient ATM with emotional support features, and now I was sitting in a lawyer's office trying to figure out how to extract myself from the wreckage. "So what do we do?" I asked. "What are my options here?" Grace pulled out a fresh legal pad and started writing. "First, we document everything. Every tuition payment, every rent check, every grocery bill you paid while she was too busy studying to contribute financially. Bank statements, receipts, emails, text messages, anything that shows the financial imbalance in your relationship. Then we look at your assets, figure out what's joint and what's separate, and determine whether we're looking at a divorce with potential reimbursement claims or just a really expensive life lesson." She looked up from her notes and fixed me with that penetrating stare. "I'm going to call this a strategic unmerger, because that sounds better than extracting yourself from a parasitic relationship where you played the role of human credit card. We're going to approach this methodically, professionally, and with the kind of documentation that would make an IRS auditor weep with joy. And by the time we're done, your wife is going to understand that publicly humiliating the person who bankrolled your success is the kind of strategic error they should probably teach about in law school." We spent the next hour going through everything I'd brought: bank statements, receipts, the list I'd compiled on my phone the night before. Grace asked pointed questions, made more notes, and occasionally muttered things like "unbelievable" and "the audacity" under her breath. When we were done, she leaned back and studied me with an expression that might have been respect. "Here's what you need to understand," she said. "This isn't about revenge. Revenge is emotional, loud, and ultimately unsatisfying. This is about receipts, documentation, evidence. Revenge fades, but receipts are permanent. You're going to collect every piece of evidence that shows what you contributed to this relationship, and we're going to use that to ensure you're treated fairly in whatever comes next." When I left her office an hour later, she walked me to the door and handed me her business card. "Don't seek revenge, Mr. Carter," she said again, and her smile was sharp enough to perform surgery. "Seek receipts. They last longer and cut deeper." It was the best advice I'd ever gotten, and I was absolutely going to follow it. I spent the next week living like a man possessed, except instead of being haunted by ghosts, I was being haunted by receipts, bank statements, and the growing realization that I'd been financially sponsoring my own emotional destruction for half a decade. Leo's couch had become my temporary base of operations, and I'd transformed his coffee table into what looked like the world's most depressing scrapbooking project: stacks of documents, highlighted printouts, sticky notes with increasingly sarcastic commentary, and enough empty coffee cups to suggest I'd developed a serious caffeine dependency. Leo would come home from his food truck shifts, take one look at my evidence wall, and say things like, "You look like a detective in a crime drama, except sadder and with worse lighting." He wasn't wrong. I started with the bank statements, printing out 5 years' worth of transactions from our joint account and my business account, watching the pattern emerge like one of those Magic Eye posters where suddenly you see the sailboat and realize you've been staring at garbage this whole time. Every month, like clockwork, there were deposits from Carter Construction Management, my hard-earned money from job sites and client projects, followed immediately by withdrawals for Amelia's tuition, her books, her rent, her everything. It was like watching a financial vampire drain my accounts in real time, except vampires are at least honest about what they are. There were months where I deposited $6,000, and within 2 weeks the account was back down to triple digits, because law school apparently required textbooks made of gold leaf and tears. The tuition payments were the most painful to catalog, probably because they represented the biggest chunk of money and the most obvious contribution to her success. Fall 2020, $8,500 to State University School of Law, paid via check from Miles Carter. Spring 2021, another $8,500, same source, same chump. Summer session. for $1,200 for some accelerated course on constitutional law that she'd insisted was essential for her career trajectory. Every semester, every payment, all in my name or from my accounts, with Amelia's contribution hovering somewhere between 0 and "I'll pay you back when I'm making lawyer money, babe." Spoiler alert, that promise aged like milk in the summer sun. Then there were the apartment leases, and holy hell, those were a trip down memory lane I didn't particularly want to take. We'd moved 3 times during her law school years. First because the original place was too small and didn't have good natural light for studying. Then because the second place was too far from campus. And finally to the luxury apartment downtown, because by third year she needed to project success to potential employers. Every single lease had my name on it as the primary tenant, my income listed as the qualifying factor, my signature on the dotted line accepting financial responsibility. Amelia's name was there too, sure, but only as a co-tenant, and her listed income was always either student or that part-time paralegal gig she'd worked for exactly 4 months before deciding it was interfering with her studies. I found receipts for everything, and I mean everything, because apparently past Miles had been meticulous about keeping records for tax purposes without realizing he was actually building a legal case against his own marriage. There was the receipt from the law school bookstore where I dropped $847 on textbooks for her second-year courses, criminal procedure, evidence, and something called torts that sounded like a dessert but was apparently about lawsuits. The receipt from the professional clothing store where I'd bought her 3 suits and 4 blouses because she needed appropriate attire for mock trial competitions. $1,200 that I'd mentally categorized as an investment in our future, but now recognized as me funding her costume for the play where I was the comic relief. And then, oh man, then I found the graduation ring receipt. Her class ring, the one she'd shown off at that disastrous dinner, the one with the law school crest, and her graduation year engraved in fancy script, purchased on my credit card for $650. The receipt even had a little notes section where the jeweler had written, "Congratulations on your achievement," which felt like a cosmic joke because the achievement in question had been funded entirely by the guy she'd just publicly roasted like a Thanksgiving turkey. I held that receipt in my hand and actually laughed out loud, a slightly unhinged sound that made Leo poke his head out of his bedroom. To make sure I wasn't having a breakdown. "You good, man?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, still laughing. "Just found the receipt for my wife's graduation ring that I apparently bought her as a congratulations for completing a degree I paid for. It's fine. Everything's fine. This is totally normal." Every discovery came with its own special flavor of sarcasm, like my brain had decided that if I was going to catalog my humiliation, I might as well provide commentary. Finding the receipt for her bar exam prep course, $3, $200 charged to my credit card, I wrote a sticky note that said, "Oh look, I also funded her license to practice law. How generous of me." The lease for the luxury apartment with its $2,400 monthly rent had a note reading, apparently projecting success costs exactly 1 Miles Carter per month. The receipts for all those study dinner takeout orders from expensive restaurants got labeled, "Feeding the future attorney who will eventually suggest I have no plan." $4, $200 worth of irony. But the real kicker, the discovery that made me actually stop and stare at my laptop screen like it had personally betrayed me, came on day 5 of my archaeological dig through our financial history. I was reviewing transfers from our joint account, tracking where money went after I deposited it, when I noticed a pattern of regular transfers to an account number I didn't recognize. Not huge amounts, usually $200 or $300 at a time, but consistent, monthly, going back almost 2 years. I cross-referenced the account number with our banking records and found exactly nothing, because this wasn't a joint account or anything I had access to. This was something else entirely. I called the bank, spent 20 minutes on hold listening to elevator music that made me want to commit white-collar crime, and finally got a human who confirmed that yes, there were regular transfers from our joint account to an external savings account. And no, they couldn't give me details about the recipient account without proper authorization, but they could confirm the transfers had been initiated by Amelia Richardson using her online banking credentials. An independent fund, probably. Translation, escape plan savings. Money she'd been siphoning off from our joint account. Money that I'd deposited. into a secret stash that I wasn't supposed to know about. I calculated the total of those transfers and came up with roughly $6,800 over the course of 2 years. Not a fortune, but enough to cover first and last month's rent on a new apartment, or a good lawyer for a divorce, or whatever escape plan she'd been quietly assembling while I was out working double shifts to support her dreams. The audacity of it was actually kind of impressive in a sociopathic way. She'd been preparing her exit while still accepting my financial support, building her lifeboat out of materials I'd paid for, all while maintaining the facade of a loving marriage. I made copies of everything, organized it into neat folders with labels that would make a librarian weep with joy, and scheduled a follow-up meeting with Grace. When I showed up at her office with 3 banker's boxes full of documentation, her assistant Dylan actually looked impressed. "Ms. Holloway is going to love this," he said, helping me carry the boxes into her office. "She appreciates clients who come prepared." Grace took one look at my evidence collection and actually laughed, this delighted sound that suggested she was already mentally spending the billable hours. "This is more organized than half my law firm's cases," she said, pulling out folders and flipping through receipts with the enthusiasm of a kid on Christmas morning. "Mr. Carter, you've essentially built an airtight case showing that your wife built her entire legal career on your balance sheet. This is beautiful. This is art. This is the kind of documentation that makes opposing counsel cry into their overpriced lattes." We spent 2 hours going through everything, with Grace making notes and occasionally muttering things like "unbelievable" and "the sheer audacity," and my personal favorite, "She's either incredibly stupid or incredibly arrogant to leave this kind of paper trail." When we got to the secret savings account transfers, Grace actually put down her pen and looked at me with something approaching respect. "She was building an escape fund," she said, "using money from your joint account. That's going to play very well if this goes to court. It shows premeditation, financial manipulation, and a fundamental violation of marital trust." That night, after I'd left Grace's office with a solid legal strategy and a renewed sense of purpose, I sat in Leo's apartment with my laptop and composed an email. Not a long one, not an emotional manifesto, just 3 short lines that said everything that needed to be said. "Hi, counsel. Attached are financial records showing the true cost of your degree. Consider this a courtesy copy before my lawyer sends the official version. Best regards, Miles." No emojis. No exclamation points. No angry rants or emotional appeals. Just peace and proof, documentation and dignity. I attached a PDF summary of the financial evidence, a greatest hits compilation of receipts and bank statements, and hit send before I could second-guess myself. Then I poured myself a drink, raised the glass to Leo, who was watching from the kitchen, and said, "To receipts. May they be permanent and devastating." Leo raised his beer in response. "To receipts," he echoed, "and to never confusing loyalty with stupidity again." My phone stayed silent for exactly 28 minutes. Then it started ringing. Amelia's name lit up my phone screen exactly 28 minutes after I'd sent that email, and I stared at it for a solid 10 seconds before Leo walked over, looked at the screen, and said, "Answer it. Put it on speaker. I want to hear this." So I did. Because misery loves company, and Leo had earned front-row seats to this particular circus after letting me crash on his couch and feeding me for a week straight. I hit the green button and immediately regretted every life choice that had led me to this moment. "Miles." Her voice came through the speaker like a tornado made of panic and indignation, trembling with that particular frequency that suggested she was either about to cry or about to throw something expensive. "You can't be serious. You're overreacting. That email, what the hell are you thinking sending me something like that? With attachments? Do you have any idea how unprofessional this is?" I let the silence stretch for a beat, watching Leo's eyes go wide with anticipation, before responding in the calmest voice I could muster. "Overreacting? Amelia, you publicly turned me into a punchline with appetizers. You stood up in front of your colleagues, your professors, and your parents, and you roasted me like I was the evening's entertainment. So no, I don't think documenting the actual financial reality of our relationship qualifies as overreacting. I think it qualifies as fact-checking." "But everyone laughed," she protested, and I could hear the genuine confusion in her voice, like she honestly couldn't understand why I was making such a big deal out of something that had been so funny to everyone else. It was just a joke, Miles. You're being so sensitive about this. Can't you take a joke? Exactly, I said, and Leo had to shove his fist in his mouth to keep from laughing out loud. Everyone laughed. That's the problem, Amelia. Everyone thought it was hilarious that you described me as a deadbeat with no degree and no plan who's been living off your income. Your non-existent income that I've been funding for 5 years. The joke was so good that I decided to fact-check the punchline with actual bank statements. Turns out, the real joke was me thinking we were partners. She started saying something about how I was twisting her words and taking everything out of context, but I was already done with this conversation. Listen, I'm not doing this right now. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. Have a good night, counselor. I hung up before she could respond, and Leo immediately burst out laughing, slapping the coffee table hard enough to make the evidence boxes rattle. Dude, he wheezed between laughs. That was cold. Have a good night, counselor. You just dismissed her like she was a telemarketer. That was beautiful. He got up to grab us both beers from the fridge, still chuckling. $10 says she calls back within an hour. She didn't call back that night, which was actually more unsettling than if she had. Instead, my phone stayed eerily quiet, and I went to bed on Leo's couch wondering if maybe I'd been too harsh, if maybe I should have heard her out, if maybe no. No, I was done with that kind of thinking. I'd spent 5 years second-guessing myself, making excuses for her behavior, convincing myself that things would get better once she graduated, once she got a job, once she felt more secure. Well, she'd graduated, and instead of things getting better, she'd decided to publicly humiliate me as her graduation present to herself. I was done apologizing for having feelings about that. The next morning, I was in the middle of eating the breakfast burrito Leo had made me. The man stress-cooked the way other people stress-ate, and I was reaping the delicious benefits when my phone rang again. Unknown number, but with a local area code, so I answered it thinking it might be a client or a supplier. Instead, I got a voice that sounded like it had been marinated in country club memberships and expensive scotch. Mr. Carter? This is Richard Thorne. I'm a senior partner at Thorne, Bishop & Associates, the firm where your wife, excuse me, where Amelia Richardson has accepted a position as a junior associate. He paused, probably waiting for me to say something, but I just stayed quiet because I'd learned that silence makes people uncomfortable enough to keep talking. Mr. Carter, I'm calling because this situation with your wife's comments at her graduation dinner has reached our office, and we'd like to discuss how we might resolve this matter discreetly. I nearly choked on my burrito. The email had made the rounds. Somehow, my documentation of financial abuse had traveled from Amelia's inbox to her new employer's attention, and now senior partners were calling me directly to discuss discreet resolution. Lawyers love drama, especially when it's happening to other lawyers, and apparently my receipts were making waves in the legal community. This was better than I could have possibly imagined. Mr. Thorne, I said, swallowing my bite of burrito and trying to sound professional despite being dressed in sweatpants on my best friend's couch. I appreciate the call, but I'm not sure what there is to discuss. I simply sent my wife some financial documentation relating to our marriage. If that's caused problems at her new workplace, well, that sounds like a conversation you should be having with her, not with me. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear him recalculating his approach. Mr. Carter, we're aware of the incident at the graduation dinner. Several of our attorneys were in attendance, and word has spread throughout the firm. Combined with the financial documentation you've provided, there are concerns about professionalism and judgment that we'd like to address before Ms. Richardson's official start date. Would you be willing to meet with me and our HR director to discuss this matter? We're prepared to make this worth your time. Worth my time. That was code for, we're willing to pay you to make this go away before it becomes a bigger problem. I told him I need to consult with my attorney and would get back to him, then immediately called Grace, who answered on the second ring sounding annoyingly alert for 8:30 in the morning. Grace Holloway, she said, and I could hear the clicking of a keyboard in the background like she was already working on something else. What can I do for you, Mr. Carter? Amelia's new employer just called me, I said. Senior partner, named Richard Thorne. Apparently my email made the rounds at their firm, and now they want to have a meeting to discuss the matter discreetly. He used the phrase, worth your time, which I'm interpreting as code for please accept money to shut up about this. The keyboard clicking stopped. Richard Thorne called you directly? Grace asked. and there was a new energy in her voice, like a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. Oh, this is delicious. They're worried about reputational damage, probably concerned that hiring someone who publicly humiliated her husband might reflect poorly on the firm's values. When does he want to meet? We scheduled the meeting for 2 days later at Thorne, Bishop and Associates' downtown office, which gave Grace time to prepare what she called the good folder, a comprehensive breakdown of my financial contributions to Amelia's education, complete with summaries, graphs, and enough legal precedent to make even a senior partner nervous. We're going to walk in there calm and professional, Grace instructed me over the phone, like we're the villains in a legal thriller who already know how the story ends. You wear your best suit, you let me do most of the talking, and you do not apologize for anything. Understood, I said, and spent the next 2 days mentally preparing myself for what was essentially a confrontation with the legal establishment that had produced my wife. Leo helped by making increasingly elaborate meals and providing running commentary on my evidence collection. You know what you are? He said the night before the meeting, gesturing at me with a spatula while he made fish tacos. You're like Batman, except instead of fighting crime, you're fighting disrespect with receipts. You're the receipt crusader. The documentation Dark Knight. That's the dumbest thing you've ever said, I told him, but I was smiling despite myself. The morning of the meeting, I put on my best suit, the charcoal gray one I usually reserved for meeting with high-end clients who wanted to make sure their contractor didn't look like he'd just rolled off a construction site, and met Grace in the lobby of Thorne, Bishop and Associates office building. She was already there, looking like she'd been born wearing power suits and carrying briefcases, and she had a leather portfolio under her arm that I assumed was the good folder. Ready? She asked, and I nodded. Remember, she said as we walked toward the elevators. Calm, professional, slightly bored. We're not here to beg. We're here to negotiate from a position of strength. The firm's office was everything you'd expect from a prestigious law firm. Expensive furniture, intimidating art, and enough mahogany to have personally offended an entire forest. Richard Thorne met us in a conference room that had windows overlooking the entire city, like we were literally above everyone else in both geography and social standing. He was exactly what I'd pictured, mid-60s, silver hair, expensive suit, and the kind of handshake that suggested he'd spent his career crushing opposing counsel between his perfectly manicured fingers. Mr. Carter, Ms. Holloway, thank you for coming, he said, gesturing to chairs around a conference table that probably cost more than my truck. Can we offer you coffee, water, anything else? Grace set her portfolio on the table with a soft thud that somehow sounded threatening. Caffeine makes me generous, she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. So no, thank you. Let's just get to business, shall we? She opened the portfolio and pulled out a document. We understand you'd like to handle this discreetly, Mr. Thorne. So would we, which means you'll need to write faster. She slid a document across the table, her opening demands, I assumed, and I watched Thorne's expression shift from confident to concerned as he read the first page. This, I thought, was going to be interesting. The conference room fell into the kind of silence that usually precedes either a declaration of war or a really expensive settlement, and I watched Richard Thorne's face cycle through several different expressions as he read Grace's opening demands. There was confusion, followed by surprise, a brief flash of what might have been respect, and finally settling on that careful neutral expression lawyers were when they realized they're not holding the cards they thought they were. He set the document down carefully, adjusted his reading glasses, and looked at Grace like she'd just shown up to a chess match with a flamethrower. Ms. Holloway, he said, his voice carrying that measured tone people use when they're trying very hard not to sound worried. These demands are extensive. You're asking for full financial reimbursement, a formal letter of acknowledgement, restrictions on Ms. Richardson's public statements, and, he paused, flipping to the second page. Mandatory firm-wide professionalism training using this incident as a case study? That's quite a comprehensive list. Grace leaned back in her chair with the casual confidence of someone who knew exactly how strong her position was and was enjoying watching the other side slowly realize it too. Mr. Thorne, let me paint you a picture of what happens if we don't reach an agreement today. My client's story, complete with 5 years of financial documentation showing how he funded his wife's entire legal education while she treated him like hired help, gets filed with the family court. Those filings are public record. The press loves a good David versus Goliath story, especially when Goliath is a lawyer who publicly humiliated the man who paid for her degree. Can you imagine the headlines? Junior associate's husband seeks reimbursement for funding her career. Law school graduate sued by man who paid her tuition. I can already see the think pieces about toxic relationships and financial abuse in professional partnerships. I watched Thorne's jaw tighten slightly, and I had to give him credit for maintaining his composure. Next to him sat Jennifer Walsh, the firm's HR director, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd dealt with worse problems than this, but probably not before her morning coffee. She'd been silent so far, but now she leaned forward and spoke for the first time since we'd arrived. "Mr. Carter," she said, directing her attention away from Grace and toward me, probably thinking I'd be easier to manipulate than my lawyer. "We understand you're hurt and angry. What happened at that dinner was inappropriate and unprofessional. But surely you can see how public litigation would be damaging for everyone involved, including yourself. These kinds of cases attract attention, and not always the kind of attention that reflects well on either party." I started to respond, but Grace put a hand on my arm, a subtle signal that she'd handle this. "Ms. Walsh, my client isn't concerned about looking good. He's concerned about being treated fairly after 5 years of financial and emotional exploitation. And frankly, the only person who should be worried about their reputation right now is your incoming junior associate who thought it was appropriate to mock her husband at a public event while simultaneously accepting the considerable financial support he'd been providing." Grace pulled out another document from her portfolio, and I recognized it as the summary we'd prepared, the one with all the numbers, dates, and receipts organized into a narrative that would make even the most skeptical person understand exactly how lopsided our relationship had been. She slid it across the table with the precision of someone dealing cards in a high-stakes poker game. "This is a comprehensive breakdown of Mr. Carter's financial contributions to Ms. Richardson's education and living expenses over a 5-year period. Tuition payments, living expenses, bar exam fees, even her class ring that she wore while delivering her little speech. The total comes to $127,000, not including the opportunity costs of Mr. Carter working additional hours to cover these expenses or the emotional labor of supporting a partner who clearly didn't value his contributions." Thorne picked up the document and started reading, his expression growing more troubled with each page. Jennifer leaned over to read along with him, and I saw her eyebrows rise when she got to the section about the secret savings account, those transfers Amelia had been making from our joint account to her private escape fund. That particular detail had made even Grace whistle when I'd first shown it to her, because it demonstrated premeditation, the kind of calculated behavior that turned a simple marriage dispute into something that looked a whole lot like financial manipulation. "There's also the matter of the comments themselves," Grace continued, pulling out her phone and setting it on the table. "We have multiple witnesses who can testify to exactly what Ms. Richardson said at that dinner. Several of them, in fact, are attorneys from your firm who were in attendance. I've already reached out informally to a few of them, and they've confirmed the general content of her speech, the part where she suggested Mr. Carter had no degree, no plan, and was living off her income. Those statements are not only factually false but also defamatory, and they were made in front of an audience of legal professionals who might reasonably be expected to believe them coming from a law school graduate." I could see Thorne doing the mental math, calculating the cost of a public lawsuit versus the cost of settling privately, weighing the reputational damage to his firm against the financial hit of meeting our demands. The thing about lawyers is that they're fundamentally practical people. They understand cost-benefit analysis better than anyone. And right now Grace was making it very clear that fighting this would cost them more than giving us what we wanted. "Let's take a 15-minute break," Thorne said, standing up with the kind of stiff formality that suggested this meeting was not going the way he'd expected. "Ms. Walsh and I need to discuss this privately. Please, help yourselves to refreshments." He gestured vaguely toward a side table where there was indeed coffee, bottled water, and a tray of pastries that looked like they'd been imported from somewhere expensive and pretentious. Once they left the room, I turned to Grace. "How do you think it's going?" I asked quietly, even though I was pretty sure I knew the answer based on Thorne's expression. "They're going to settle. Grace said confidently, pulling out her phone to check messages. Thorne's a smart guy. He knows that fighting this publicly would be a nightmare for the firm. They're probably in there right now figuring out how to spin this internally. Maybe whether they need to rescind Amelia's job offer or just put her on some kind of probationary status. Either way, we're walking out of here with what we came for. She was right. When Thorne and Jennifer returned 20 minutes later, so much for 15 minutes. Thorne's entire demeanor had shifted from defensive to resigned. He sat down, folded his hands on the table, and looked at Grace with the expression of a man who'd just agreed to something he didn't particularly like, but recognized as necessary. "We're prepared to offer a settlement," he said, and I felt my heart rate kick up a notch. "Full reimbursement of documented expenses. We'll need to verify the amounts, but based on what you've shown us, we're looking at approximately $127,000. We'll draft a formal letter acknowledging Mr. Carter's financial contributions to Ms. Richardson's education, which can be used in any future legal proceedings. And we'll include a confidentiality clause preventing Ms. Richardson from making any public statements about Mr. Carter or their marriage, professional or otherwise." "And the professionalism training?" Grace prompted, because of course she wasn't going to let them off easy on that point. Thorne actually winced slightly. "And yes, we'll implement mandatory professionalism training for all associates and junior partners, with a case study based on." He paused, clearly hating every word he was about to say. "Based on this incident, emphasizing the importance of maintaining professional boundaries and avoiding public statements that could be construed as defamatory or damaging to personal relationships." Grace smiled, and it was the kind of smile that probably made opposing counsel have nightmares. "Excellent. I'll have my office draft the settlement agreement this afternoon. We should be able to have everything finalized within the week." She stood up, and I followed her lead, shaking Thorne's hand with probably more enthusiasm than was strictly professional. As we rode the elevator back down to the lobby, Grace turned to me and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Carter. You just got a very expensive divorce settlement without actually getting divorced. Though honestly, after this, I'd recommend filing anyway. That woman is going to hate you for the rest of her natural life." "Good," I said, and I meant it. Let her hate me from a distance, with a legally binding agreement preventing her from talking about me. We stepped out into the sunshine, and I felt lighter than I had in weeks. "Thank you, Grace. Seriously, I don't think I could have done this without you." "You're welcome," she said, extending her hand for a professional handshake. "And for what it's worth, you're going to be fine. Better than fine. You're going to build a life that doesn't require anyone's permission or approval, and it's going to be spectacular. Now go celebrate with your friend who makes tacos, and I'll call you when the paperwork is ready." I did exactly that. I went back to Leo's apartment, told him everything, and we ordered enough food to feed a small army. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to work out after all. 6 months later, I'd turned pain into profit with Carter Renovations and Consulting, a business that was half construction management and half life coaching for people who'd forgotten how to build anything worth keeping, including their self-respect. My first consulting clients were 3 lawyers from Amelia's firm who'd heard about my story and wanted advice on protecting their assets before their own marriages imploded. Irony so delicious I could taste it with every invoice I sent. My new apartment was small but completely mine, filled with furniture I'd picked out and peace I'd earned the hard way. My fridge was actually stocked with real food instead of takeout containers, and my sense of humor had upgraded from bitter to brilliantly sarcastic. Leo started calling me the comeback contractor, which was better than the guy who got roasted at dinner, so I accepted it. Amelia tried emailing once with a subject line that read, "Maybe we can talk?" And I responded with exactly 7 words. "My hourly rate's $200. Legal counseling extra." She never responded, which told me everything I needed to know about how much our talk was actually worth to her. Some conversations aren't worth having, especially with people who only value you when it's convenient. 1 year later, I stood on a stage at a business seminar for men rebuilding after toxic relationships, holding a glass of water like a prop in my own redemption story. The topic was how to stop being your partner's side project, and the irony of a construction guy teaching people about building better lives wasn't lost on anyone. My wife once introduced me as a man with no degree and no plan. I said, watching 300 faces lean forward. Turns out, my plan was just waiting for the right exit. The laughter came, the good kind, with me instead of at me, and guys lined up afterward to shake my hand and share their own stories. One wife told me her husband had sent her my video, and they'd both learned something. That felt better than any settlement check. Later, in my workshop surrounded by tools and peace, I poured myself a drink and raised the glass to nobody in particular. "Enjoy it," I said quietly, remembering that night at the Green Marlin. That really was the last joke anyone made at my expense. Because I'd walked away from being someone's punchline and built something better. A life where respect wasn't negotiable and dignity wasn't optional.